for all the new faces, welcome. We do this every first Wednesday of the month, and this is our final one for this semester. And so we've had VR, we've had design systems, we've had VC and tech, and this one's kind of another area of interaction design, which is like the intersection of like civic participation, research, and kind of like public policy and service design. So the reason we've invited Chelsea is because we're interested to hear more about the New York City Digital Playbook. For all of you who don't know, this May, Mayor de Blasio announced the NYC Digital Playbook, which is an overarching plan for the government to increase equity and help all New Yorkers participate in the political, civic, cultural life of the cities. I found the 12 principles really cool. Number 2 is my favorite, communicate simply, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And so we thought who might be better to speak about this than Chelsea, who is the Executive Director of Public Policy Lab, and this was the organization that led the massive research process that informed the Digital Playbook. And this is something that she'll be talking about more in detail tonight. And she's also kind of familiar with SVA, having spoken here before the Design for Social Change program. Yep. So how this will work is we'll have a talk, and then we'll have a few moderated questions, 4 or 5, open to the floor for questions. I think there's a pop quiz at the end of the talk, so there might be some with prizes. Yes. So without further ado, let's welcome Chelsea.
So thank you so much for inviting me to come here tonight and talk to you about the Digital Playbook. I'll tell you a little bit first about the Public Policy Lab and some other things that we've worked on in addition to the Playbook. So we're a not-for-profit organization founded about 5 years ago. Almost all of our public interest service design projects are partnerships with government agencies, municipal or federal agencies. We also do some strategic consulting work with philanthropies who are working on government innovation or other sort of social innovation related projects. And our goal is typically to design services or policies specifically for low-income and at-risk populations. So what that means is that over the course of our history, we've done work around students with disabilities, around veterans' needs, around work around incarcerated opiate users, senior citizens using Medicare. We explicitly have looked to work on projects that dealt almost every time with very different kinds of end user populations, because our attempt is to spread the idea that a service design approach and a human-centered design approach is broadly applicable to services of all kinds, rather than saying it's only if you have a particular subject matter expertise in a particular kind of service delivery area. So this is something of what our process looks like. Typically, we go through a series of design research, then design prototyping, then design testing activities. I always have my little asterisk up there to remember to tell you, though, that in any project, there's a long period that I think of as phase 0, which is the process of getting to the place where you can even begin doing research with partners and with members of the public. And that's something I'm happy to talk about some more as we discuss these projects later on. All of these phases of work, though, really involve the same kind of 4 things, no matter which phase you're in, which is making a plan about what you're doing and why you're doing it, doing hands-on collaborative work with the end users of a given service or policy. And we constitute users very broadly. We don't just mean the sort of named end user of a service, but also the frontline service providers who provide that service, for example, on the theory that you can't actually improve a service or policy if you don't make it so the people who are delivering it are happy to be delivering it. Then doing a round of idea refinement by professional designers. One question always in our work is how to bring steps 2 and steps 3 ever more into a greater level of simultaneity. And then finally doing a round of sort of storytelling and market building so that people are prepared to actually adopt the things that we design. So I'll give you some, I'm going to give you the rapid tour of PPL's projects, and then I'll go in a bit more of a deep dive into the Digital Playbook. So we've done a project here in New York City around affordable housing, specifically around improving the application process for low and middle income families who are applying for affordable housing units through the city of New York. Oh, There we go. And that project eventually ended up in the design of a set of 5 informational materials, which now have been distributed millions of times to hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, and I think are now translated into 7 languages, something like that. But almost more crucially than the informational materials themselves, we helped the agency think about different kinds of ways of actually distributing those materials and engaging different kinds of partners in the community to be ambassadors for the materials and for the information that they held. Because often it's great if you have a lovely thing that has information, but it doesn't matter what that thing is if you can't actually get it into the hands of somebody who needs it and who wants it in a place, in an environment where they can use it. We had actually some really great feedback from one of our partners there recently who told us that, I don't know if all of you are following the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development's press releases. I imagine you are. But they recently came out and said that they've made some changes to the way that they're administering the program. And that those changes are directly related to feedback that they received from the community-based organizations who now function as housing ambassadors in communities across the city. Prior to doing this work together, they had no feedback mechanism. They had no way to know what community members thought about the process of applying for affordable housing. Now they've built these strong relationships based on an interaction model that we designed for them so that they both push information to community-based organizations and also collect feedback from those community-based organizations. That's changing the City of New York's housing policy. So that's really exciting for us when we begin to see the kind of long game results from creating mechanisms for there to be grassroots user feedback back into a policymaking process. High school choice, in New York City, 80-some thousand 8th graders every year have to go through an application process to apply for a high school seat. And the question really that the New York City Department of Education asked us was, what kinds of things might we do to better, to make the choices that 8th graders are making not just notionally successful in that they get placed in a school, but actually successful in that they reflect kind of a meaningful engagement with the process. So we did a rich research project with students, with their parents, with DOE staff, with DOE leadership across the city, working with kids to better understand their choice-making processes, and then created a series of kind of design prompts for the agency around a whole series of different mechanisms through which they could better help families and students and guidance counselors make good choices. And this resulted in the creation of a series of apps, and now there's actually a digital tool that the New York City has developed to allow families to better sort through different kinds of high school choices. We also worked with DOE on the question of how to better provide transportation to students with disabilities. New York City's public schools educate about 1.1 million students. Most of those students get to school by walking or by taking the subway, but a limited number, about 150,000, are eligible for school bus service. Some because they live far from school, but about 50,000 of them because they have significant enough mental, physical, or behavioral disabilities that they're entitled to have a school bus come to their house and pick them up and take them to school. That service that serves about 45,000 students costs $1 billion a year, out of an entire operations budget for the department of about $20 billion. So it's an incredible amount of resource that goes to it. And it will perhaps not surprise you to hear that the service is nonetheless generally considered to be very bad. That the agency is continually sued, has all kinds of problems with issues on the buses, that there are ongoing, extremely serious service issues around the service itself. So one thing that the agency didn't actually have was any kind of a representation of what actually happens when a family goes through the process of attempting to get special transportation services for their child. So one of the first things we did for them is actually map that, which, you know, as many of you who may have been involved in mapping different kinds of user journeys may have discovered, it's pretty mind-blowing for complex organizations who have never done any kind of visualization of their own processes to actually have that represented back to them. And then once we had this representation of what was actually going on in the service, then we were able to make a series of recommendations around how to improve that process for family members, looking at how specifically to create more collective and collaborative decision making between the multiple players on the family side, on the school side, on the transportation side, to better end up creating services that actually met the needs of the child. We did some work with the city of Louisville, specifically around the intersection of jail overcrowding and opiate use. The goal was to understand what's being experienced by people who are being incarcerated in the city of Louisville who are dealing with addiction, with the intention of saying, how does Louisville not only push better services into people who have opiate usage issues in the jail, but how do they also intervene before people go to jail? And how do they release people from jail with a set of supporting services such that they don't end up right back in the jail? So again, for the benefit of the mayor's office and the Department of Corrections there, we created a series of personas about different kinds of people who we spoke to in the jail, capturing and aggregating different sorts of experiences that led them to the moment that they found themselves incarcerated in Louisville, looking at this kind of cyclical user journey from a point of being okay through a period of having their opiate usage create significant problems in their life to hopefully getting back to a place where they were once again okay. And one of the things that was interesting for us was that a number of the people we spoke to, of course, had never actually been okay. That they were essentially born into the danger zone. And how do you begin to think about intervention strategies that respond to that population of users as opposed to folks who actually have some past experience, maybe even 40 or 50 years of non-usage, and they now find themselves in their 50s and 60s with a compelling need to use opiates. So it was a really interesting project around the very divergent kinds of user groups, and then thinking about how a jail is or is not an appropriate place for service delivery. So we ended up making a series of recommendations to them again that was about intervention strategies in advance of jailing, ways to do what we call TAC, targeted alternatives to corrections, meaning how do you essentially not send people to jail, but rather divert them into various kinds of treatment organizations? How do you do capacity building exercises inside of jail, both for people who have been incarcerated and critically for corrections officers? And then how do you, when people come out of jail, divert them into various kinds of maintenance medications so they don't find themselves once again illegally using? We've done a number of projects over the last couple of years with the Veterans Administration, looking at veterans' access to mental health care. Specifically, in this first project, looking at veterans mainly who were dealing with effects of PTSD. So we spoke with veterans across the country, did field research in North Carolina, Florida, Montana, and Southern California, and then did a mapping exercise where we did kind of pretty detailed story collection from veterans about their experiences, both their time in the service and then also their attempts post-service to get access to mental health care, both from VA and from other kinds of partner organizations. And then looked at, did again a kind of internal mapping exercise for VA, looking at the experience that people have when they're first attempting to access VA medical services around mental health care, and made a series of recommendations, some of which were quick wins to improve access, some of which were more complicated pilot projects, and some of which were kind of big systems transformations, which really require kind of new leadership at the agency and a deep focus in changing the way that mental health care is adopted. We've done some other ongoing work with VA more broadly around how to use human-centered research and design methods. So there's a new office at VA called the Veterans Experience Office. It's one of the first kind of big experience design offices at the agency level inside of the federal government. So they're beginning there to do the first kind of cross-divisional design at VA. VA has big kind of service delivery units, which typically don't coordinate across each other. So one of the things that we're trying to do is create a kind of shared language that all the different units across VA can share. So this was again an attempt to kind of map the entire veteran experience, really from the point where they join the military to the point where they pass away, and think about how VA delivers services at all of these different life stages, as just a first attempt to say, okay, here are the places where we can drill down. And that involved, again, field research in people's homes and workplaces. But then we were able, and it may seem funny, but it was actually easier to do ethnographic research in people's homes and to have the agency feel like that was a safe thing for us to do than it was for us to get access to do research at VA medical centers. The idea that there would be designers and researchers setting up here, as we did in like the lobby of a VA medical center, and sort of hailing people and say, come talk to us, like that actually felt more anxiety provoking for the agency than having us kind of like separately go off and speak to people in a much more in-depth way in their home environment. But I feel like I'm now going to use this precedent, I'm going to flog this precedent all over town and be like, see, look, you can let us come and hang out in your lobby and it's gonna be okay. Nothing bad will happen. Okay, so the playbook. More detail on the playbook. So the goal here was the chief digital officer of New York City at the time, Jesse Singleton, felt like there are all these digital initiatives happening across the city, but there was no kind of overarching theory of what these initiatives were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do it. Like many people were with really good intentions attempting to improve New York City's digital service delivery, but without there being any kind of particular plan. So what's the overarching goal? Why is New York City trying to deliver its services through digital technologies, and then how should it do so? So we developed a project plan that looked something like this, and the we in this case is the staff at the New York City Mayor's Office of Digital Strategy, PPL as the research lead, really great folks at a consulting firm called Bennett Midland, which is based here in New York City and focuses specifically on public services and public agency clients as the primary strategy lead with PPL assistance, and then design support from a design firm called Bureau Blank. So the three providers and the city as a very kind of closely embedded team. So there was a planning phase, which again, I recommend that everyone never skimp on the amount of time that you dedicate to that process of kind of goal setting and actually figuring out what the work is. Then moving into a research period, then a period where we're doing kind of synthesis of all the research findings and development of strategy out of it, which is also simultaneously leading into a process where there's kind of a separate effort to do some evaluation and metrics definition so that the agencies can do some ongoing project management assessment around the impact of the things. Then development of the sort of digital plan as the final output, and then the creation of a digital storytelling tool to tell the story of all the work. So the discovery research, actually, let me go forward one more. So we knew that we were going to talk, of course, to a bunch of people in the administration in positions of authority and responsibility around the creation of digital services. And then the city had a strong desire to make sure that they talked to a bunch of folks from the civic tech universe, because they wanted those people to be not just, those people are not only thought leaders who have a lot of good insight into best practices around digital service delivery, but they were also potential partners for the city as they thought about sort of next steps and how to build community and things like that. So it felt to us, thinking about those first two pools, that we were going to have a very rich representation of college-educated native English speakers who probably had upper quintile incomes and had a broadband-enabled device within a foot of their hand 24 hours a day. But we felt that that description of humans did not, in fact, accurately reflect the diversity of the population of New York City. So therefore, when we thought about who we wanted to speak to in terms of city residents, we said explicitly, how do we find New Yorkers who are disenfranchised? Who do we talk to who is farthest away from receiving good digital service delivery? And the short list we came up with was people who in fact have no home or personal access to digital devices, or who have very limited personal access to digital devices, people who are socially isolated, people who don't speak English at all, people who don't speak English and who also are not literate in their native spoken language, folks who have physical or behavioral disabilities that make it challenging for them to use digital tools, folks who have legal status issues that make it uncomfortable for them to interact with government. So we had a kind of listing of people who we thought were going to have the most challenging experiences when attempting to interact with the city's digital services. And that, as you see, we ended up being pretty well split between men and women, decent diversity on kind of race and ethnicity targets, really focusing on low-income city residents, because again, we felt like we had a sort of over-representation of upper-income folks in the other interview pools, and then it tried also to go across the city as well. So what that looked like was, showing up at people's homes and workplaces and asking them a whole series of questions about their usage of digital tools and technologies generally, and their usage of city services specifically, and then trying to find the sort of intersection point. One thing we asked everybody to do is if we could take a picture of them with their device. So we ended up with this really kind of funny census of everyone's phones, and particularly what's on everybody's home screen, which I think would actually be its own sort of fascinating little research project. So what did we hear? Because one of the questions that Cozy gave to me to talk about was, how do we synthesize the work? So this is two of the Design Trust's fellows on this project, Sarah Ligis of Small City, New York, who's an amazing design researcher, and Hafun Wong, who's the co-director of the Behavioral Insights team in the country of Singapore's government, who was here as a visiting fellow during the time that we were doing the work. And honestly, it embarrassingly looks like that. And it looks like that. You're all familiar with what this looks like. It looks like a bunch of raw data on Post-it notes stuck on a wall, but the magic, of course, comes in the clustering of those Post-it notes. So there is a lot of moving around of that idea content to try to generate meaning, and a lot of renaming of clusters to see what kinds of information hierarchies emerge, so that you begin to feel like you're making some kind of order out of chaos. And that is always a collective effort, but it's not always continually a collective effort. What we find in processes like this is that it's usually good for people to do some individual work, some individual sorting, some individual naming, and then there's more of a kind of a group activity where there's a conversation about what it is that we're developing, and some arguing, and some disagreement over what the best names are, and some creating of options, and then there's kind of a going back to the individual work. And that at least we find that it's most productive to kind of flow back and forth between those two kind of modes of working. With this project also, we were trying, I don't think I have pictures of it here, but since we were this kind of interesting sprawling team, where PPL was the research lead, but we had two collaborative partners in Bennett Midland and in Bureau Blank. And then additionally, we had strong participation from our city partners at the mayor's office. And then additionally, New York City Economic Development Corporation was the sort of official holder of this contract. And so they were sort of interested in how we were spending their money. So they would come as well to meetings that we were having. So we were doing a lot of cyclical synthesis in the form of pinups, where we would start with something like this, and then we would do a slightly kind of organized version of it and put it onto big pieces of paper and like carry it across town and stick it up on the wall in somebody else's office and go through a process of like hashing through, does this make sense to you? And that was actually, it's not the fastest way to work, but it's actually a really good way to work when you're trying to get a bunch of different people to come to a kind of collective agreement that this policy that you're developing is actually something that they're going to want to get behind. So what did we hear? We heard things from New Yorkers about their kind of human experiences of digital technology and the way in which digital technology kind of made them feel in their life. And some of those things were positive, like we heard about some good kind of universal design precedents, things like 311 or the NYC ID, where people had really kind of positive feelings of collective ownership or the city taking care and being a useful tool. And we heard about community-based organizations also being a great kind of source of what felt like personalized and kind of directed service provision. But we also heard about all kinds of examples of lack of access and lack of trust, not feeling like it was necessarily safe to share information or get information from the government. We also heard a huge amount about time and money scarcity. You know, there's a lot of folks in this city, 25% of the city is living below the federal poverty limit. That's $18,000 for a family of 3. So like thinking about what that kind of lack of financial resource does. You know, one example I just ran across the other day, which I thought was fascinating, is if you're calling a government office and you're put on hold, that's going to burn up the 4 pay minutes on your cell phone. And that's something that higher income people who may have unlimited minute plans are just never going to think of as a design constraint when they're creating a digital service tool for a lower income population. So we just heard a lot about the ways in which the city's services didn't accurately respond to the profound time and money scarcity of New Yorkers. We heard about people's actual kind of their service experiences, about how the actual service delivery, the interaction model of the services either worked or didn't work for people. And so engagement barriers, stuff is not in a language that I can understand. Stuff doesn't work on my phone. I'm blind, and this doesn't work with my screen reader. We actually did the first significant research that our team had ever done with people who had visual impairments, and that was tested the patience of the poor people with whom we were doing research, and was incredibly useful for us to realize how clueless we were as researchers. Because like literally we walked into a room to do research with somebody who had a visual impairment with a consent form written out on paper. You don't realize what you don't think about until you are in a situation where you're like, whoa, we weren't prepared for that and didn't plan well for it. So it's very useful to stretch your own boundaries as a researcher so that you discover how bad you are at certain things in situations which are not the situations which may be typical for you. So I encourage you all to fail abundantly in that way. We heard about information complexity, simply that like this thing that you want me to do is just too hard and requires too many steps. And we heard about a few tools that people really, really liked. The New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, has a tool where you can pay your rent online and receive a kind of digital receipt for having paid your rent. And you can also set it up so that you can set up a particular day to pay your rent. And this was like hugely helpful for people and made them feel really good. Like, oh, I can go in, I can control what day this is going to get debited from my account. I can have proof that I actually paid my rent. And that is a huge innovation for folks who are living in public housing and really helpful. So we did hear some bright spot stories like that. And we heard bright spot stories also, obviously, about non-city tools. And so one of the big findings that we brought back to our city partners is, in many cases, must the city design a thing? When people use search, they're going to most likely go first to Google. They are not going to go first to the search box on nyc.gov. So really, it's not so much about investing so much time and money and making nyc.gov search better. It's about doing better SEO of city data so it's findable to people and the tools that they already want to use. And then we heard about kind of institutional issues and problems around the way that back-end development is broken, around problems with kind of information sharing and process sharing in between individual agencies. We heard a bunch of fascinating stuff about privacy, around the ways in which Americans, where people are much more comfortable giving their deeply private data to commercial enterprises than they are to the government. So that was a kind of fascinating learning. And that was like went across classes, across races, across linguistic groups, everything. Everybody's like, yeah, sure, I'll give my info to like Chase Bank or to Time Warner, but I don't want to give it to the city. So that was a fascinating thing for the city to deal with when the city thinks about kind of expansion of service provision, that they have to respond to the fact that many residents are going to feel less comfortable if the thing is branded as a government service as opposed to a commercial service. And I think that's a kind of a hard one for folks inside of the city to respond to, because they can't believe that they are perceived as being so untrustworthy by their fellow residents. Sure.
Was there any evidence that's why they don't trust? Was there any, anyone had any?
You know, I think it's just some idea that it's a mixture of things. It's that, you know, it's like on the veterans projects, every time we've talked about privacy with veterans, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard the story about the OPM data breach. Like, it's just like, oh, well, you know, the Chinese stole all my security clearance data. You know, like there's just this sense that the government is hacked. The government is not a safe place to store your information. The government's going to lose it. The government's going to misuse it. And there actually, when we got into some deeper conversations with folks inside of the city about the potential uses of residents' data, and this was another interesting thing about the privacy. It was that the way in which people want ease and they want privacy simultaneously. But of course, the more that you make all of the city's information about you known to all of the other city agencies, the more you particularly get into very tricky territory. Like, what if the only time you've provided your information to the city is the time when you called in a domestic violence complaint, and then you go to get a tennis permit and they know your name and your home address? Like, do you want those two systems to know each other and know things about you? Or do you want those systems actually to be siloed? And so, like, those are conversations which, what we ended up saying to the city, and we'll get there eventually in terms of the strategies and the recommendations, was just that you're going to have these conversations with the residents of this city. There's going to have to be better mechanisms for the populace and the government to talk about what the trade-offs are. And people who have power are going to have to be more transparent about what they know and providing tools to individual members of the society to say, opt me out of that. You know, one of the things we talked about is it possible for the city of New York to tell you as a resident everything that the city knows about you? So that you could then say, oh, I don't want you to know that about me, or I don't want you to track that anymore, or I want you to disassociate that knowledge from that knowledge. And then what kind of burdens does that create on the back end? You know, so this is actually a long and sprawling conversation, and one that can easily get glossed over in the service of greater usability. All right, moving on. So, all of these conversations, as I described, we ended up having these conversations with residents, and then we had them again, all over again, with folks from the city and from various kinds of civic tech organizations. And this has to do with this kind of like pin-up process we were going through, where we were making recommendations, we were making strategy in a kind of lo-fi way, and taking it out to people and saying, muck around with the recommendations and strategies that we're developing. Again, so that we ended up feeling like we were getting input from those folks, but they then perceived themselves to be participant makers in this policy development process. So in the end, one thing that happened that was unexpected we thought that this project was going to result in two things. A set of kind of strategies for the city, and then some recommendations around tactics. Meaning, here are some kind of like, intentions that city agencies should act on, and then here's how to make those intentions real. But the deeper we got into it, the more that we felt that there was actually this higher level that we had to be explicit about, which were these kind of higher, I'm going to call them moral and ethical concerns around governance and duty that we had to address before we could get to the place where we talked about strategies. Because these were actually the motivating factors that drove the strategies. If you had different core values, you would end up with different strategies. So we wanted to be explicit about what the core values were that we were advancing. Once we had these, and really it worked like this. We didn't, all right, there was a little bit of back engineering, as there always is in a process like this, because you don't end up with 6 principles and 12 strategies without there being a little bit of an interplay back and forth. But mainly, we started from the strategies, and we started from the principles and built the strategies out of them. So we ended up here because we had had a really clear values definition process first. And these were really about essentially things that we felt that the city could adopt as core kind of operating goals. And that really the task of our city partners, once we on the design team walked away, was to say, okay, how do we make all these things real in all of the different agencies of the city? And then underneath each one of these 12 were a whole set of different specific, very kind of like picky tactics, which were really on the level of an individual person with some responsibility to creating digital services in their office tomorrow could say, well, I can try to do that. In terms of what we actually built to roll this stuff out, there was always a kind of a plan that there would be a digital tool to share these things. So there's a website, which is actually at nyc.gov/playbook. Looking at Shanti, playbook? Okay, so it's nyc.gov/playbook. And that's all of the strategies, all the principles, all the tactics are there. There's like a feedback form. People can like upvote which of the tactics they like, But most importantly, it's public. And this idea that the city was going to do this collaborative policy development process, and then they were going to publish it on the internets where everyone could look at it, was a pretty big deal for them. That they were going to come right out and say, this is what our goal for ourselves, we are not yet here, but we are going to try to get here. And that's actually a really kind of scary thing to do in the world of public policy and public governance, to say because implicitly that admits that things aren't here yet, that these are in fact aspirations that they're going to work on. So it was kind of powerful for them to say, we're going to put all this stuff out in the public where people can see it. Then additionally, mainly because we thought it would be kind of fun, we made some little cards which also had all of the principles and the strategies on it, and distributed those to all the agencies of the city to say, here's an actual tactile thing, so that you can have this and you can sit this on your desk, or you can walk into a team meeting with your team. Now, honestly, the value of method cards like this is absolutely in their kind of rollout and implementation. So this rested absolutely on whether a given team was interested in using these tangible tools. But it's a question for us as designers, how do we make the things, particularly when we're designing policy on this level, how do we make it into a thing that somebody feels like they can manipulate, as opposed to a thing that they just kind of look at? And then it was, again, this was publicly announced at Civic Hall. Mayor de Blasio and Ariana Huffington met and spoke about the need for this kind of better digital service delivery. And that, again, was this kind of commitment by the city to say, we're thinking about this new way of operating in the digital space, which is driven by resident needs. Oh wait, before I go there, we reached out to one of our project partners. This stuff came out in May and said, hey, how's it been? And what she said back, this is just from this afternoon, she said, rollout has been great. Having a clear vision that we made public makes it easier to ask for internal reforms. First of all, launching this thing caused many silent allies in different departments to come out of the woodwork and helped us find people who are motivated to make this happen. Because of this, we've launched a plain language squad that meets monthly to discuss various projects. They've even workshopped the language for key projects, and she named some. Secondly, having certain principles public has given people in other departments a way to push their leaders to think more about digital use. For example, this one agency was going to release an app, like a native app, before thinking more about whether that would actually be meeting users where they are. And instead, they're going to create a web tool that uses open data and releases open data. Finally, insistence on user testing has prevented a lot of subpar projects from being launched. Can't say which, though, she says. Sometimes success, and I thought this was the best line, sometimes success isn't the launch of a successful tool, but saving taxpayer dollars and city time by preventing a poorly thought out product. And this is a thing that I've been talking about a lot with other practitioners and colleagues, this question of these kind of untrackable opportunity costs. Like what are all of the things that aren't happening because of the way that policies and systems are designed now? We can't see how the status quo generates costs or burdens compared to some as of yet unrealized future. And then simultaneously, even if you can make a good thing happen, it's hard to then quantify the savings in time and cost because you didn't do the bad thing instead. So there's kind of an interesting measurement problem around measuring the cost of the status quo, or in the best case scenario, when you're actually able to do something innovative, measuring the benefit of that innovative solution as opposed to maintenance of the status quo. So that's a thing that we're interested in continuing to kind of think about as we're developing new projects with public agencies. I think that's it for me. Did I answer all of Cozy's questions? Let me see. I think I did, but you can ask me more of them now if I didn't.
How does Public Policy Lab choose what to work on, and how do you, engage? How do you get connected with or choose your partner organizations to kick off the projects you described?
Sure. Sometimes projects come to us, and sometimes we try to gin up projects. And so there's no one answer. Like in this particular case, the city of New York knew that they wanted a digital playbook. I think they had been observing similar efforts by the US Digital Service and 18F, and they were like, hey, we want to do some of that here for New York City as well. So they had put out an RFP, and in that case, we responded to that RFP along with partners. So that's a case where sort of someone else has defined the need, and then we're responding to that need. In other cases, we get interested in a problem, and then we try to get somebody to let us work on it. So our housing work, for example, came out of that process. We're right now trying to develop a project that would be about better service delivery for homeless children, and still trying to find the right partner for doing that work. And that's just because it's an interest of ours, and we think that would be a good place to spend some time.
Cool. And I know that the PPL has a fellowship program.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about
Sure.
that?
So our projects typically, on any given project, we award project-specific fellowships to researchers and designers from a wide variety of multidisciplinary backgrounds. Typically, these are folks who are not right at the beginning of their careers, but rather have 3, 5, 10, 15 years of experience doing this work professionally. It's great when folks actually have prior experience working on projects with public agencies. But we have had a number of fellows who were really strong researchers or designers who have never done any prior government-related work, and that's what actually is attracting them to working on projects with us. And typically it's just we're working on a project, we see that this particular project, we're in phase 0, we're having these conversations with our government partner, we're trying to figure out what the work is going to be, and we see, oh wow, it would be great if on this project we had somebody with this kind of background or this kind of capacity. And then we go looking for people who have that kind of background.
Cool. So the next question. So in the first semester, we had a public designing for public spaces class, and not first semester, the second semester, first year. Yeah. And my team, we were focusing on Sunset Park, and we ran into a problem where I think there's a community of illegal immigrants there, and they were kind of like aloof and didn't really want to share anything. So do you have any tactics to approach communities that might be afraid to share?
So this project, the Digital Playbook project, we, all of our resident interview participants came to us via community-based organizations. So it was this kind of multi-step process where we were partnering with the mayor's office. The mayor's office had relationships with a bunch of community-based organizations, which were interestingly political relationships as opposed to kind of functional or operational relationships. It was like they knew that organization because that organization had supported de Blasio's mayoral run. So it's interesting when like your very functional life intersects with politics in ways, And so those community-based organizations were then contacted. The project was described. They were asked, were there sort of members of their organization or service people who were benefiting from their service provision who they thought would be interested in talking to us? And then, so they reached out to people and then came back to us with contact information for those folks so that we could actually get in touch with them. So that sort of trusted partner, on the ground partner, as the sort of end point recruiter, I think is really helpful. Because if it's just, you want a trusted handoff, really. So in a lot of works we've done, we've gone through kind of networks of personal relationships to reach people. So it's like, it's a friend of a colleague's cousin's sister, and like you work your way out through a web of relationships. You have to watch for a certain kind of selection bias then, because you can end up, for example, the mental health work we did for the VA, we ended up talking disproportionately to folks from the special operations community, partly because they had a lot of combat experience, and so they were more likely to be experiencing PTSD issues, which were leading them to seek mental health care, but also because that was sort of where our first point of contact was, and so the relationships that we developed sort of spread out from her in that community. So you have to be a little careful.
Cool, yeah.
So, sorry, back to your original question. So I think the way that you might have reached those people was by identifying a community organization that had a trusted relationship with them.
Sure, yeah.
And then asking that community-based organization to be your kind of preliminary outreach person. But again, I would say, recruiting is frankly the most difficult component of discovery phase work. It's the hardest part, and it takes the longest, and is the part which is consistently underscoped both in terms of time and budget.
Yeah, I think we just ran around Sunset Park and got a bunch of rejections.
Yeah.
But learned a lot from that. Next question. So there's been a lot of talk of echo chamber and filter bubble, just how we're surrounded by recommendations that we like, we are working with people that we like, we live in places that we like, and we're kind of filtered out of the discussion that we don't believe in. And this has gathered steam past the recent election results. And so what we're noticing is that like a lot of designers are kind of starting to start movements to, create conversation, try to like reach across the divide, like set up opportunities for these conversations. I'm wondering if you have you have a take on this movement, and if you have any, like advice there?
Well, I guess two things. I think it is super helpful when you're doing work to look at the entire population of the users and say, are they adequately represented in our research pool? So it's like if you do federal level research, you are basically not going to get away with a research plan where you only talk to people in New York City. And that is appropriate. It is appropriate that you get on a plane and fly to Wyoming, because it's a different experience accessing a federal, service when you live in a really rural area where the nearest service delivery center is 50 miles away, and you're going to drive there, and when you get there, everybody knows you because you grew up in that county, and so there's no anonymity in your service usage. Your clients are going to require that of you, as they should, and actually they shouldn't even have to require it from you. You should sort of self-investigate to a degree that you're like, wait, are we actually talking to an even semi-representative pool of the people who are using this service? So that's why I described sort of here with the Digital Playbook work, that we kind of looked at who we were already talking to city staff and civic tech folks, and we're like, whoa, this does not represent the population of New York City. What are we going to do to compensate for that? Often, of course, you are not going to get anything like a statistical sample. So then you need to go looking for extreme use cases. So I think that's what I described to you with the Digital Playbook, that like we essentially said, who is least able to take advantage of digital service delivery? Let's go talk to them, in combination with talking to a bunch of people who are absolutely in a good position to use digital services. We will then come to some sort of understanding about the mean. So that's where a kind of extreme use case approach is helpful, because you maybe don't have the time or the budget to talk to 3,000 people. Right. More broadly, though, I always worry about designers doing stuff that isn't functional. I get pretty cranky about, student projects where students work particularly with vulnerable populations and generate student work which doesn't actually have any meaningful value for the population who you used as research respondents. And your institution benefited from the fact that you did that. And where's the benefit for that user population who's already disadvantaged in multiple ways? So I worry about efforts where people are like, we're going to go and talk to one another. But what's the talking doing? I think that designers have a responsibility to actually make things that have value and function in the world. And in as much as your work isn't resulting in that, I would just say don't spend too much time on it. I mean, of course, we have to do exploratory things and imagine stuff. Not all of it's going to be super, not every project can have tangible value. But I think you should at least ask yourself, is this going to actually result in actual lived change?
Yeah, good advice, first years. Take that advice. So last question is just, where do you think, what are some issues that you think really need service design right now, and what are you excited about Public Policy Lab working on?
So I'm smiling at Shanti because we actually have a list back at the office of the dream projects. We keep adding things to it. I would love to do...
Closely to the list, and if you have hookups.
Totally. I want to do more jail work. And I'd love to do some policing related work. I just heard a rumor that NYPD is going to be, quote unquote, hiring a service designer I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's a firm. I don't know if it's a person. I don't know what NYPD thinks service design is. I have none of those answers, but I'm excited about it because I think that our policing could use some service design. Yeah, the jail work obviously was mind-blowing, and as long as we've got as many people incarcerated in this country as we do, it feels to me like we have a responsibility to think about that in all of its forms in terms of its impact on people's lives. There's a huge amount of like physical space design work to be done around jails and jailing. There's obviously a gigantic amount of service and interaction design work to be done around the experience of people who are incarcerated as well as the people who incarcerate them. Corrections officers are actually not very happy people and don't much enjoy their jobs often. And that has obvious results for the people who are incarcerated. So thinking about that, I think, is good and important work. I think I'm super interested in stuff around family planning. I think it's really hard for anybody, but particularly for a woman, to have a good life if she can't control her fertility. So working on that, I think, is critical. What else do we have on the list?
We're working on services for homeless children.
Yeah.
You mentioned that before.
I think it'd be fun to do some IRS work.
Oh yeah, that's on our list.
Because the DMV and the IRS are sort of like the big things that touch everybody. So if you can do good design work there, you can begin to have a kind of more collective conversation with everyone about the nature of public services.